So this week we bring together the themes for our course, which are around diplomacy, it has to do with the interactions between two or more countries, and intelligence, which has to do with the collection of information that is then used to guide diplomacy and foreign policy. And we begin our discussion this week by reflecting on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which of course was this past Monday. And just to give you some context, his actual birthday is on January 15th. And the holiday was determined to be the third Monday in January, which was officially signed into law by President Ronald Reagan on November 2nd, 1983. But it would take an additional 17 years for states to recognize it as a federal holiday. And one of the things that we know is that beginning in the 1980s, there was a concerted effort to make this a reality. And something that you may not know is that Stevie Wonder actually became instrumental as part of the collection of thousands of signatures, and he worked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s family, including Coretta Scott King. And one of the things that he used to get attention for this particular effort was his song Happy Birthday. And I'll actually set up a link so that you can listen to the song and actually view the lyrics, and you can see that it was very much deliberately made for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of the things that we know about Dr. King Jr.'s role in the context of the Cold War is that he was actually a key figure in both foreign policy and diplomatic relations. And part of the reason, of course, was the fact that he was an international figure. In 1965, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in support of his civil rights effort. And of course, that brought international attention to the racism, but also the violence that was inflicted on peaceful civil rights protesters. In the context of the Cold War, however, some of his other views also came into the crosshairs of the American intelligence community. Dr. King's views, whether on the war in Vietnam or the belief that activists were connected to communist causes or being influenced by communism, basically made him a target of the intelligence community. He was, of course, aware that part of what was happening in the United States as a direct result of the civil rights movement was also part of larger proxy wars that were being fought between the US and Russia. The racism and discrimination that was being laid bare as a direct result of the fight for voting rights as well as civil rights became part of Russian propaganda, and they used it as a means to show that the democracy that was touted by Americans was actually contingent, that it was not available for everyone, and that Russia, through communism, was indeed a superior ideology to bring about equality. Of course, this is much more complicated. We'll actually take a look at some of the ways in which this takes place, but it's important for you to know that that is part of what was being used at the time and how Dr. Martin Luther King actually intersects with it. So in the 1960s, leaders in Congress and both President John F. Kennedy and eventually President Lyndon B. Johnson saw the attacks on civil rights activists as a public relation nightmare on the world stage. And so that is going to become a catalyst for the ways in which both presidents are going to interact with the civil rights movement. One of the things that we know is that the war in Vietnam had been a lightning rod. So in the early years of the 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. actually will not be as open about his critiques of the Vietnam War. But by the time he publishes his last book, which is what you see pictured here, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos, Our Community, those views are laid bare. And they are put on par with the racism that is taking place in the United States. Soon after he published this book, on April 4th, 1968, he was assassinated. And a couple of months later, the first bill proposing that a Martin Luther King Jr. Day be established was put forward. As I mentioned before, it did not become a reality until 1983, and then it took an additional 17 years for all of the states to adopt it and for it to be officially become a federal holiday. So one of the things that we know in regards to both issues of diplomacy and intelligence is that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s views and activism resulted in FBI investigations that contributed to his phones being wiretapped, and he became the target of covert operations beginning in 1955. And 1955 is an important year because that is the year that the Montgomery bus boycott will actually take place. J. Edgar Hoover believed that the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in particular were being influenced by communists. And so this was a really big concern because, of course, we were in the midst of the Cold War. He became the target of the counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO. And the title of this particular program is called Racial Matters. And it basically targeted anyone who was involved in what they deemed to be racial politics. By 1967, so this is the year that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, a new COINTELPRO program named the Black Nationalist Hate Groups Program was created. And in the documentation, we know that there was a fear that Dr. King Jr. and the SCLC were potentially terrorist organizations who could unify Black nationalists and then in turn reject nonviolence in favor of both Black nationalism and more aggressive tactics. This, of course, is a pretty extreme view of the way that they viewed him. But in those documents, we also know that they called him a messianic figure. And so there was real fear being displayed in the context of the intelligence community about what could potentially happen. So this, of course, eventually will result in congressional investigations of the FBI that will begin in the 1970s. And that's part of the reason why we have all of this documentation in terms of how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was targeted, as well as how the FBI was developing their intelligence information. So as you move forward and as you begin to read that first chapter in Gaddis, keep that in mind, because when we traditionally think about the Cold War, we think about sort of the United States and the outside, but it's also really important to keep in mind that everything that is happening within the United States is crucial to the way that the Cold War was being played out.